Our second speaker, Dr. Xu Xiang Zhang, is an associate professor of art history at Oklahoma State University in the U.S. She received her BA in traditional Chinese architecture from Beijing University and MA and PhD in art history from Northwestern University. Her multidisciplinary journey touches upon a wide variety of visual materials ranging from traditional East Asian architecture to contemporary art in China. She's published a number of articles that reflect her interest in print culture, military history, medium specificity, and spectatorship in China's modern period. Professor Zhang received her 2017 Oklahoma State University College of Arts and Sciences Junior Faculty Award for Scholarly Excellence. Let us welcome Dr. Xu Xiang Zhang. Hello.
Thank you very much for the lovely introduction. And I also want to thank all the conference organizers for your hard work, and especially in this really crazy time, to still be able to have a conference. Okay, so okay, I have one question. Do you hear the echoing of the sound from your side?
We hear you very well.
Okay. So the title of my paper is called Centrifugal or Processional, Divine and Mundane Power in Ancient Chinese Funeral Grid. Xu Xiang Zhang, the father of modern China and the leader of the Chinese Nationalist Party, died in March 1925. His body was first preserved in a Buddhist temple in Beijing, awaiting for the completion of his mausoleum in the capital city, Nanjing, construction of which was not complete until the spring of 1929. The location of Xu Xiang Zhang's mausoleum was on the Purple Gold Mountain, site of the Ming Dynasty imperial tombs. Aligning his mausoleum with the Ming imperial tomb not only evoked Sun's early mission to restore the Han ethnic primacy in China, but also borrowed the 1,000 years of tradition of ancestral worship in Chinese funeral culture, conferring upon him the status of an ancestor for modern China. And the slide I have here, and on the left, you have the plan of Xu Xiang Zhang that was designed in 1925. The picture on the right is the father of modern China visited the Ming Dynasty imperial tomb after he established the Republic of China. Unsurprisingly, the American-trained architect Liu Yanzhi laid Xu Xiang Zhang's mausoleum out on the model of the Ming Imperial Mausoleum, with a memorial arch and tablet pavilion, sacrificial hall, and a coffin chamber on the south and north-oriented central axis. And when you compare the ground plan of the Sun's mausoleum with the Changlin of the Ming Yongle Emperor, we can notice that both structures follow a symmetrical order and emphasize the possession and deepening of space from the entrance gate to the burial chamber embedded in a mountain. I think that the similarity is actually more clear if you see that both tombs from the aerial perspective. You definitely see that how there's a kind of a deepening of space through the central axis. Chen Yunjian commented, constructing Xu Xiang Zhang's mausoleum in such a classical funeral revival style allowed the ruling party, the Chinese National Party, to translate tradition of ancestral worship into loyalty to the party. Her statement, in turn, implied that constructing funeral sites for ancestors had historically played a vital role in politics. And China is definitely a big warehouse of some of the most significant burials in world history. The famous statement from Zuo Zhuan suggests that, quote, the fundamental matters of a nation are ancestor sacrificed and military. So which definitely show you that ancestral worship is just as important as the military for the nation. In the belief that the ancestor would determine the nation's future, Chinese tomb and ancestral temple were carefully built for regular conducted worship. So my presentation focused on the ground plan of the imperial Chinese funeral sites, which, similar to the planning of Chinese capital cities, also follow a grid pattern. As the similar universal form of grid planning gave rise to different political ideologies, the planning of the traditional Chinese necropolis speaks to a different understanding of afterlife and ancestral worship. So part 1, centrifugal versus processional in Chinese urban grade. Before we start our discussion on Chinese funeral grade, I would like first to introduce 2 different types of Chinese urban grade. And the Chinese historian generally believe that the basic system of ancient Chinese urban planning, especially the architecture spatial pattern characterized by the grade and its urban box in relation to the hierarchical political system characterized by courtyard, can be traced back to Shang dynasty, so around 2000 BCE. A number of the capital cities, such as the Chang'an of the Tang dynasty, Bianliang of the Song dynasty, and Beijing of the Ming and Qing dynasty, are more or less enlarged great urban boxes, similar to the Erlitou Palace on the left of the slide. Those capital city and the palaces display a centrality, symmetry, and a hierarchical spatial layout in their overall composition. And the political power did not only exist in human domain. The power structure of ancient Chinese belief system is divided into 2 levels, heaven and human. Among them, the human power structure has a strict hierarchy, with imperial power being the highest, and the legitimacy of the highest human power originated from the mandate of heaven. In other words, heaven is an existence higher than the emperor's power. As demonstrated by the silk banner from the tomb number 1 at Ma Wangdui, Hunan province, the heavenly domain is depicted above the human domain. And this is actually just one of many examples showing that the heavenly domain rules over human domain. An architecture historian, Xu Yitao, found that there are 2 basic spatial types in traditional Chinese urban grid structure. One is organized in the radial symmetrical manner and emphasize the center as a representation of divine power. And so divine power include, the heavenly deity and the Buddha, etc. An example of such kind of a centrifugal space include the Temple of Heaven in Beijing and Temple of Earth, and also something called Mingtang, which is the religious ritual structure in the ancient China. And the other type of urban grade follow bilateral symmetry order, and it emphasizes the procession of deepening of space in an urban grade along the central axis to protect and deify the mundane power, which include emperors and noble classes, and especially consolidate social hierarchies. There are numerous examples of this kind of processional grade as well, such as the Forbidden City you see here, which is a Google Earth map, and also the Tang Dynasty city, Chang'an, and which you saw in the early slide. And according to Xu Yitao, the centrifugal space highlight heaven and heavenly deities. And the processional space, in contrast, highlight people or people's governorship. The centrifugal heavenly space has a single center, and its form reflects the ultimate authority of heaven. In contrast, human beings are impermanent, and therefore the processional grade consolidates political power and manages social relations without underscoring the eternity of any individual. Part 2, from the ancestral temple to monumental tombs. Now let's shift our attention back to the urban planning of the Impure Chinese funeral city, many of which also follow a great pattern. For the Chinese, the ancestors' journeys and the situation after death have always played an important role on their offsprings. And the understanding of the Chinese impure tomb needs to be contextualized in the relation to the structure and the symbolism of the ancestral temple, which is, according to historian Wu Hong, the legitimate place for holding both political and religious ceremonies during the Western Zhou dynasty, so which is from 1047 to 772 BCE. The ancestral temple was the most important symbolic architect of nation. legitimizing the rulership and at the same time extending the temple system into a large social network. According to the famous Bucharest, and here's a quote, "And there are kings under heaven who divide the land to establish a country, who set up the capital city by setting up ancestral temple and offering sacrifice," unquote. The ancestral temple gave legitimacy to political powers and therefore functioned as the starting point of a capital city's plan. As far as the religious function of the ancestral temple are concerned, and they usually function as sites in which people could pose questions to their ancestors, a place facilitate communication between human beings and a higher authority through the inscribed text on the oracle bones. In this context, worship of ancestors demonstrates a desire to be connected to a higher course, reaching beyond the human domain. Not only was the ancestral temple complex built in the center of the capital city, but the planning also materialized in the centrifugal pattern. According to the Bucharest as well, the emperor has 7 temples, with 3 of them in the Zhao location and 3 in the Mu location. And the founding emperor's temple makes the number 7, unquote. When examining the layout of Impure ancestral temple complex, we can see that the founding emperor's temple is located in the center, with the temple of his descendants positioned according to the Zhao Mu system, which is a very complex interlinear rank system. Archaeological evidence is scanty for the earlier ancestral temple of the Zhou dynasty. However, Wang Mong, who took over the Chinese imperial throne of the Han dynasty and founded the short-lived Xin dynasty, and tried to restore the Zhou classical ancestral worship tradition. Unsurprisingly, Wang Mong built a number of ritual architectural complexes. According to the concrete archaeological evidence, Wang Mong's ancestral temple complex consists of 12 ancestral temple sites, led by the founding ancestral site in the south. Each ancestral site was heavily walled with 4 entrance gates in each direction. Wang Mong's monumental ancestral temples follow the principle of the 7 temple mode in the Zhao Mu system from the Bucharest, with just slight revision. Part 3, translating the centrifugal grid into the funeral system. According to art historian Wu Hong, the ancestral temple has symbolized the entire ancestral linear spirit, whereas personal tombs were individual and relate to human remains, and therefore considered to be secondary and even unclean. And therefore, the tomb of early days was constructed to be small and humble underground concealment for human remains. Yet, in the Eastern Zhou dynasty, the central focus of ancestral worship shifted from the collective linear temple to tombs of family and individuals. During this period, which is about the 4th and 3rd century BCE, large mausoleums became popular. A traditional ancestral temple relied on the ritual vessels and the ritual activity to manifest their political and religious significance. By contrast, a funeral structure relied more on their impressive architectural forms to communicate their significance. One of the core values of the ancestral temple was its expression of divinity over human realm, manifested through its centrifugal layout. The idea of the absolute authority and everlasting dynasty was also applied in the centrifugal plan of the tomb of the first emperor of the Qin dynasty. The Legion Mausoleum is the very center of the funeral city, and the ground plan of the funeral city demonstrates 3 layers of an urban box. In the center, the Legion Mausoleum, the inner city, and the outer city. And since this Qin Emperor's spirit chamber has never been opened, we can only obtain information about it from the Sima Qian's report in his famous records of the Grand Historian. And Sima Qian's description implied that the interior of the tomb was made into a symbolic space, a miniature of the universe. The symbolic arrangement and the decoration of his burial chamber demonstrate that the soul of the deceased emperor is divine and eternal. The monumental Ligian altar that was built above the burial chamber reinforced the notion that the first Qin emperor spirit was transcendental, and the Ligian altar was a site at which the emperor's descendant would send prayers. However, archaeological excavation of the Qin funeral city has revealed a strikingly different understanding of the afterlife. Archaeological exploration currently concentrates on various sites surrounding the Legion Mausoleum Mount, including the Terracotta Army to the east of the tomb mount. The Terracotta Army consists of 1,000 of earthen soldier sculptures, carriages, and horses to serve as a garrison for the mausoleum. Here, we can sense the idea that the nether world is similar to the mundane world. The necropolis provided the emperor with his worldly possessions, his army, palace, and valuables, and a burial style different from that of his unopened burial chamber, indicating a more realistic imagining of the world after death, an imagining based on the imitation of the world of the living. Nevertheless, these two ways of interpreting the afterlife, number one is the deceased emperor as divine and eternal, and number two is that the deceased emperor keeping his palace life after death. And these two forms of imagined afterlife coexist without conflict, or one dominates the other in the funeral city of the Qin emperor. And over the course of the 1,000 years after the Qin, imperial funeral structure continued to develop. By the time of the Song dynasty, the new book of geography published detailed accounts of the funeral system of the Tang dynasty and the Song dynasty. According to this book, once the imperial funeral site has been chosen, the emperor was to be buried in the center of the site, a place named Mingtang, whereas his official and subject were to be buried according to their social rank in an imaginary great space. The structure of this funeral city not only confirms the emperor's political superiority after death, but also highlights the religious significance of the emperor's tomb. The religious connotation of Mingtang can be traced back to the function and the symbolism of ancestral temple and the sacrificial temples. Overall, the graded space of a number of the imperial Chinese tomb demonstrate an integration between the ancestral temple worship and the intention to replicate a living environment for the departed soul. Consequently, those imperial tombs incorporate architecture elements from both ancestral temples as well as contemporary palaces. Part 4, consolidating the processional funeral grades. And commenting on the development of Chinese funeral site, architecture historian Liu Dunzhen observed that from the Qin dynasty to the northern Song dynasty, imperial tomb usually adopt a centrifugal layout, and the burial mound was located in the center of the funeral structure, with entrance gate in 4 directions. In the last 2 dynasties, the Ming and the Qing, the layout of the imperial funeral city was dramatically altered, with the burial mound moved to the end of the funeral grade, and a number of gates added along the central axis. Compared to the early period, the 2 striking characteristics of the Ming imperial tombs are, number 1, the funeral layout resembling that of the palace, using a processional grade to deepen the space. Number 2, the focus of the necropolis have shifted from with the sacrificial hall at the core of the funeral city, and the burial chamber, the burial mound placed in the deepest section of the entire necropolis. And there is perhaps no better example of the processional grade than that of the Forbidden City, the palace for the emperor of both Ming and Qing dynasties. Heavily guarded by layers of walls, the Forbidden City was repeatedly separated the inside from the outside, and the space was effectively deepened, with the imperial family residential unit located in the northern end of the city. Where the emperor's residential unit was located in the concealed northern quarter, the central building of the Forbidden City is the Hall of the Great Harmony, which is also the largest building within the Forbidden City, and one of the largest wooden structures within China. Built above 3 levels of marble stone based, it was the location in which the Ming and the Qing emperor would, along with officials and ambassadors, conduct important ceremonies such as the enthronement. In order to meet the emperor, the individual was required to walk along the central axis and pass as many as 7 gates before arriving at the Hall of the Great Harmony, the meeting point between the inner and outer court. A comparison between the Forbidden City and the Changling Mausoleum of the Yongle Emperor of the Ming Dynasty is very instructive. Just as the Hall of the Great Harmony functioned as the most significant ritual structure in the Forbidden City, the Sacrificial Hall of the Changling Mausoleum also serves as a focus of a funeral complex. Moreover, the architecture structure of the Sacrificial Hall, with its 9 bays, 3 levels of marble stone-based, and a double-eaved hip roof, follows the standard and scale of the Hall of the Great Harmony. North of the Hall of the Great Harmony, it is located in the inner court of the Forbidden City, whereas behind the Sacrificial Hall, one enters the burial district of the Changling Mausoleum. Here, the Sacrificial Hall served not only as a space for ritual activities associated with ancestral worship, but also as a meeting point between the living and the spirit from the netherworld. Overall, we can see numerous resemblance between the Forbidden City and the Changling Mausoleum in their architecture hierarchies and adoption of the spatial strategy of the processional grade. Okay, so here I'm going to move to my conclusion. So by focusing on the origin of 2 types of Chinese funeral grade, namely ancestral temples and impure palaces, and this presentation has attempted to uncover some of the basic nature and the fundamental purposes of traditional Chinese funeral structures over 1,000 years. And I want to conclude my presentation with a discussion of the Xu Xiang Zhang's mausoleum again. As I mentioned earlier, Xu Xiang Zhang's mausoleum followed the traditional of the processional funeral grade of the Ming Dynasty mausoleum, and its final location, a burial mound, was 19 meters higher than the Ming tomb in Nanjing. And therefore, Xu Xiang Zhang's mausoleum was intended to elevate his political status from the elected provincial president to the father of modern China, even succeeding the Ming emperors. The site was regarded to be the most sacred place in Nanjing, and therefore the Nationalist Party's capital plan in 1929 designated its administration zone adjacent to Xu Xiang Zhang's mausoleum. The Nationalist Party also planned a variety of worship rituals related to Xu Xiang Zhang's mausoleum. Indeed, as a political culture, subsequent getting worse and worse after the outbreak of the Second Sino-Japanese War, the worship ritual became more and more frequent and emotionally provocative, with Chiang Kai-shek ostentatiously shedding tears as he read Xu Xiang Zhang's word during a ceremonial visit to the tomb just before them fleeing with his garment to Chongqing in 1937, and which is shown in the picture on the right. The architect Liu Yanzhi did make some departure from the Ming Impure tomb formula. For example, the Sacrificial Hall deliberately adopt elements from world-famous memorials and a tomb like the Lincoln Memorials and the Napoleon tomb, in order to equate Sun with a great Western leader, and thereby confirming his rightful place in the pantheon of world history. In this way, Xu Xiang Zhang's mausoleum signifies a profound desire to synthesize a divergent belief into a single funeral setting. Overall, despite the Chinese funeral structure's obvious link to the most conservative traditional Chinese customers, this tradition continued to influence Chinese architecture and visual culture, echoing developing Chinese belief in the afterlife and the organizing principle of the Chinese society itself. That's all for my presentation. Thank you very much.
Hello there. Okay. Thank you, Dr. Xu Xiang Zhang. Thank you very much for your talk.
Thank you.
We have just a couple of questions from our participants, if you don't mind. So one of the questions is, what inspired your work? What personally drew you to this topic?
You know, my area of research is on the Chinese art and architecture in the early 20th century. So actually, I did a lot of research on the Xu Xiang Zhang's mausoleum, and which was very similar in its design, as similar to the Ming Dynasty mausoleum. So that's where I started with my research, and which also, starting with the modern tomb, and I started looking at some of the traditional funeral structures, and I'm also interested in the urban planning of the urban grid in Chicago. So it just really, strangely enough, everything come together into this paper, and both traditional and modern, and East and West to some extent.
Okay, thank you. Just one more question.
Okay.
So your talk focuses on ancient grids. Are any of these grids currently used or influenced by in modern times? What would be their influence?
You mean the ancient grid influencing the modern time?
Exactly. Or? Yes.
I think so, but in a way that is different from how the traditional grid kind of it's a different way of organizing the population. And we still have, the function of traditional Chinese grid was pretty much to create the hierarchy of the Chinese society, especially in the capital city. So you get the center, you also get the periphery. The further you are from the center, the less important you are. And however, the modern Chinese urban grid seems to be almost kind of the opposite. And the distance between the center and the periphery does not really equate with the political power or the social rank. So I would say that the contemporary Chinese urban grid was more like I would say like growing a machine that would really help the real estate to go further and further. Like as you see that the Beijing city start with the city of Beijing start with forbidden city, and now in the contemporary China it just get larger and larger. Now we get like the 5 rings of the city ring road, like just circling the forbidden city. Yeah, so they still use a grid, but it's in a very different mechanism from the traditional grid. So the goal is to get larger. The goal was not to protect the center anymore.
Okay. Thank you again very much for today. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Have a pleasant morning or pre-morning where you are. Okay.
Yeah, so the sun is going to go up soon.
We have one more question. Sorry, we just got one more question. Okay, so we have a question. In your culture, does symmetry equal harmony? Interesting question.
That's an interesting question, but it's kind of hard to answer. Yeah, I guess you can say that symmetry equals harmony. Also, symmetry equals order. Symmetry equals. It just kind of corresponds to the part of the human nature that look for order, and looking for discipline, and yeah. And when you feel that, you get everything in the right place and everything is organized, and they will bring harmony.
Agreed. Okay. So thank you very much again. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. I would like to thank both speakers for interesting talks. The second session is now over. So please stay tuned for our next stage, introducing Vitrina Gallery at HIT and the current digital exhibition, The Gridded Fabrication. An exhibition tour will be available for you at any time, but stay with us in this room.